in 5 or 7 seconds.
Welcome everybody to the session on a new trade model for climate, labor, and moving our agenda forward. We are so grateful to have two wonderful panelists coming to you today. Let me just go ahead and introduce our panelists. First, Jamela, I'm going to start with you. Jamela Thompson is a senior advisor to the U.S. Trade Representative. She previously served as chief of staff to Georgia's 5th congressional district and was deputy chief of staff for none other than the wonderful U.S. Representative John Lewis, who I think about often, always doing good trouble. In addition to managing and developing her office's policy team and operations, she was directly responsible for appropriations, budget, tax, trade, foreign affairs, human and civil rights and voting rights, oversight, and other policy areas. Before she was with the esteemed Mr. Lewis, she worked as a legislative assistant to Barbara Lee. Prior to coming to the Hill in 2011, she was a volunteer coordinator and translator for various nonprofit organizations. When you look at her record in terms of awards, she's a leader in the trade movement, in the civil rights movement, and we are so happy to have you here. Brian Galligan is a Jesuit, and he is a research and policy assistant at the Jesuit Justice and Ecology Network in Africa, based in Nairobi, where he leads the network's global environmental advocacy and research agenda. This work includes engaging with food and climate negotiations at the UN, providing capacity building on environmental governance for faith-based actors, and supporting the Catholic Church's leaders to speak knowledgeably about climate change and biodiversity loss. Brian's academic research focuses on nutrition-sensitive fishery management and includes publications on both fishery science and governance. He holds an MA in social philosophy from Loyola University in Chicago and a BS in biology and theology from none other than Fordham University. Jamela and Brian, thank you so much for coming to us today to have this important conversation. Jamela, can we start with you? Because many of the folks that are gathered here are very interested in what the Biden administration means as we look to building a worker-centered trade policy that fosters inclusive prosperity and takes into account the planet moving forward. So maybe if we can just open up with your thinking, what can you tell us a little bit about what this policy means, how you're approaching it, what are the opportunities ahead? We know that you are negotiating all around the world, so I don't know how you keep up with your day, but we are very, very interested to hear how you're approaching it, and I'm going to stop there.
So maybe I'll just begin. Thank you so much for the really generous and kind introduction, Laura, Father Galligan. It's always good to be with you. It's good to be with friends. It's wonderful to be in the assembly. Thank you for this space. It's an honor to represent the Biden-Harris administration, to serve Ambassador Tai, and to join you today for Ecumenical Advocacy Days, which is one of engaging with the faith-based organizations around social justice was one of my favorite parts of my work for both Congresswoman Lee and Congressman Lewis, and it's wonderful to continue to be in service and solidarity with you here today. A couple of weeks ago, Ambassador Tai delivered the 2023 Winger Lecture at American University, Washington College of Law. And I think that her remarks really set the table for the conversation today when she explained why this administration and economies around the world are working to write a new story on trade policy. It's one that makes us more resilient, our economy more sustainable, and as you noted, Laura, our results are intended to be more inclusive. She noted in her remarks that the traditional approach to trade prioritized aggressive liberalization and tariff elimination. It produced significant benefits, massive increases in economic activity, and historic reductions in poverty in some regions. But she noted that the tunnel focus on maximum efficiency, above all, has had significant costs and side effects. Prosperity without inclusiveness contributed to rising inequality and wealth concentration, concentrated among the richest 1%. My colleague, Laura, whom you know well, my partner in crime, my partner in think, the ambassador's other senior advisor, Beth Walton, is both a trade lawyer and a historian at heart. And in researching the roots of the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, and the World Trade Organization, she highlights that the initial focus of the Atlantic Charter was on economic security, and most importantly, full employment for working people. This charter specifically states that the goal of collaboration between all nations in the economic field is with the object of securing for all improved labor standards, economic advancement, and social security. So here we are again, but in that moment, in the aftermath of two crippling and devastating global wars, it was crystal clear that economic insecurity was a threat to democracy. Now, here we are today, the global economy is evolving, it is complex, and there are cracks exposed by the pandemic, by the climate crisis that we'll discuss today, supply chains, Russia's full-scale and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, and food insecurity. These grave realities, this awareness and historical context, I'm a historian also, as he noted, underscore the need for more durable, sustainable, and resilient trade policies that factor into our current needs and our global aspirations for the future. This means that we must be both intentional and innovative in economic policy. The United States has a duty to rise to this challenge and to create trade policy that is tailored to our trading partner, to our workers, to common priorities, and also to collective prosperity. The reality is this, as you noted at the beginning, and why we're engaging in so many different areas. One size does not fit all. The experiences of workers in manufacturing and agriculture and services and textiles and apparel, it differs, and we must be strategic in our approach. This is the reason why the president's vision for trade policy needs a moment. Upon taking office, President Biden charged Ambassador Tai in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative that she leads to advance the administration's belief that trade done right can be a force for good that benefits all people and all workers. We seek to advance and design trade policy that centers on the well-being and hopes and aspirations of workers, restores our relationships with key global partners, and it addresses the climate crisis and reflects and applies these lessons of history to build a more equitable and inclusive economy. The president often notes that we have to build the economy from the bottom up and the middle out. And it's a common value that we hear constantly from our trading partners who recognize that economic inequality is a destabilizing force. The reality is this, is that no one's thirst is satisfied by a trickle of water, and in reality, the same applies for economics. As a result, we strive to advance trade policy that is a force for good, that is inclusive, that embodies the true spirit of a representational democracy, and that we set the table each and every time with intentionality and inclusiveness. In addition, I think that some of you may know that the ambassador is spending a lot of time to put the U.S. back in USTR. So we pair every international trip with a domestic one so that we're connected with real people and communities across the country and advocate for their interests around the world. So I will pause there and also say it's an open invitation. So, if you invite us, we will try to come. In all of these engagements, we seek to listen with empathy to our constituents' concerns and experiences, to share updates and developments and ensure that their voices are front of mind when we sit down at the negotiating table. Because good policy is being informed by facts and not assumptions. That is the reason that on day one, the president directed us to confront the significant data and research gaps that exist. One of the president's first actions was to sign Executive Order 13985, an executive order to advance racial equity. It established a whole of government framework directing every department and every agency to do their part to advance equity in their policy, programs, and initiatives. This is very different from DEIA. The president also named the USTR for the first time to the Gender Policy Council, to the White House Council on Native American Affairs, and he designated Ambassador Tai to co-lead with HH Health and Human Services Secretary Javier Becerra, the White House initiative and the President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. In particular, under this work, the ambassador requested that the U.S. International Trade Commission, or the USITC, conduct a two-part investigation into the distributional effects of goods and services trade and trade policy on U.S. workers. She recognized that the United States needed an independent, unbiased catalog of what's been done and how trade affected workers by race, ethnicity, age, skill, region, income ability, orientation, and gender. She asked that the information process include public roundtable discussions and academic symposium and a public literature review. And the USITC went a step further by also including a public reading, a public hearing, and a comment period. The result, and I encourage every person to take some time with the results, is that in November, the USITC released an independent, unprecedented public catalog of what's the effect of past trade policies have been on U.S. workers. And we at UST are using this work to this next part of our discussion to inform our trade actions and engagements. The second part of that investigation establishes a new standard by including the distributional effects and future probable economic effect analysis in the USITC's responses to our USTR requests. This is unprecedented. It is historic and it is significant, but we are just at the beginning of the process. I just want to close really quickly with returning to that original question that you posed in terms of us thinking about some of the challenges and what keeps me up at night. I'm worried that the constituencies take all of this work and this intentionality and this progress for granted. I'm worried that there are not enough hours in the day to fight for working people, to combat the climate crisis, to stand up for justice and encourage equality, and that folks are getting exhausted and frustrated and tired. And I know that a participatory democracy, it takes a lot of work. And what we need is more incoming. We need to recognize and lift up the progress, to offer ideas and solutions, and to ensure that the people who hold these seats in the future remain committed to these new standards and progress, and they apply the histories and the legacies and the information of the past towards a better future. I'm going to pause there, Laura. I know I talked a little bit too long, especially since I have to jump off a little bit early, but I look forward to our discussion and listening to
Jamila. You couldn't hear the amens because I was muting myself. You know, we have long for our community. You know, when you say economic justice, racial justice is such a deep part of that, both in terms of impact. So when I read the ITC report, and it stated what we knew for so long, that the most vulnerable communities, particularly Black and Brown communities, were the ones where you had major dislocation, you know, coming from NAFTA, what was then NAFTA, coming from normalizing relations with China. Trenton used to make stuff. And I think the goal of the administration has been to intentionally try to bring those jobs back to those communities. So thank you so much, Brian. You're going to have a bit of a different view because you are on the ground, and as you're working for climate justice, labor justice, we know that these things are interconnected. I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit about what does it look like? What is the advocacy on the ground in? I know you're in Kenya, but you work with folks throughout Africa. What does that look like? What are the challenges in particular? And then let's have a conversation between you both, because there is a way forward if we organize, if we work, and I think that's where we want to go.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura. It's really good to be here, and Ms. Thompson, just an honor to get to have this conversation with you. As you mentioned, Laura, so my organization, the Jesuit Justice and Ecology Network Africa, we're Pan-African. And so what we do is we draw on the experience of Jesuits and those who work with us around the continent. really as a way of knowing what's going on, trying to understand this view from below, the reality in communities, and what that says about especially global policies. And so much of that policy environment is really dictated by the United States, whether it is unilateral US policy or simply the power that the United States has in global processes. So we need to recognize that for us in Africa, and I speak as an American who simply lives and works here, but for those of us in Africa, the United States looms very large. And US trade and investment policy is incredibly important. And that's what I'd like to talk about, is this interplay between trade and investment. I think, as many of us know, Ms. Thompson and others are in the process right now of negotiating a trade and investment partnership between the United States and Kenya. So pairing these things together, I think, could be really promising. And I'm so encouraged by vision that the Biden and Harris administration has, writing a new story on trade. I think it's wonderful. But right now, the view from the ground is so profoundly not that vision. So I'd like to just give a couple examples of what it is like right now. And so to talk about investment, first of all, well, actually, just before I even get there, to be very, very clear that right now in Africa on the ground, climate change is not this big future far off reality. It is a very much an everyday lived reality of people here. Most people on this continent are practicing natural resource based livelihoods. So when the rain doesn't come, whole villages do not eat. It is already quite dramatic. And that is the background against which a potentially climate and worker friendly trade policy that could empower communities is really going to be playing out. It's already playing out. So let's talk about investment, first of all. Right now, there is incredible investment in fossil fuel infrastructure in Africa. And it is expanding at a clip that is totally incompatible with maintaining warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're not near 1.5 Celsius. We're at 1.1 or 1.2, depending on who you ask. And we're already feeling the effects. We just had a 2-year very severe drought in the Eastern Horn of Africa that would not have happened had it not been for climate change. And this is a drought that caused famine. So even getting to 1.5 degrees Celsius is not good. And right now we're set to go way beyond that because of investment in fossil fuel infrastructure in Africa that is extractive. It's designed to use Africa's resources to be burned in the global north, in Europe and in the United States. Most of this is not US companies, although there are large US oil companies that are playing a big role. However, United States finance and investment is playing a very big role. So for example, if we go to Cabo Delgado in northern Mozambique, there is a currently stalled but likely to resume a series of natural gas projects. This is offshore gas, but there are terminals that are kind of scheduled and in construction and being built on the northern coast of Mozambique. This is a place that has had intense civil strife for some years. The United States used just under $5 billion of taxpayer money to de-risk these investments. And that was needed because they're incredibly risky. It is a very volatile place. It is a conflict zone. And then when this happened, when we brought all of this foreign money and development in, it resulted in displacement of people from their lands, and it fueled this conflict. You mentioned, Ms. Thompson, this dynamic of economic insecurity and inequality being a threat to democracy, and that's exactly what we're seeing, right? So we see this pronounced inequality growing because of United States investments in large part, and investments in things that are undermining lives and livelihoods for the very locations where they're taking place. And then that happens, and we get this really intensified conflict. There have been gross human rights abuses on all sides, massacres. We're talking about helicopters firing into crowds of civilians, destroying homes. We're talking about Al-Shabaab burning whole villages. We're talking about the government also using this as cover to target opponents of the oil and gas projects with arbitrary detentions and torture and disappearances. So this is about as bad as it gets, and it's very directly tied to United States investment. I'd like to take you north. We'll give you one more example, which is trade infrastructure. So in Lamu on the north coast of Kenya, this also involves oil and gas. There's a pipeline project planned. But similarly, a coastal community very reliant on natural resources, both marine and terrestrial. And they are, the Kenyan government is building this big mega port. They're intending to have 32 berths. They've already built the first 3 and totally destroyed the corals in this bay that local fishers rely on. They've displaced fishers from their fishing grounds. People have died as they've sought new trade routes that take them into more exposed waters. And farmers have been kicked off of their lands. We had a court judgment that ruled that this development was illegal under Kenyan law, both because it violated human rights protected in the Kenyan Constitution and because the environmental and social impact assessment process was just woefully inadequate. And from the strategic impact assessment was even never done. And this is trade infrastructure, in fact, headline trade infrastructure in the country that right now the United States is negotiating a trade deal with. So what does trade policy look like that supports communities? Just to highlight a couple of common things between these two cases, these two examples, is there's a very strong divide between what political leaders at the national level are interested in and what is really beneficial to the most marginalized communities. There's, in both cases, little to no community consultation or involvement. In Lamu, for example, they found out about this project on the news. And then finally, these projects, both of which involve trade and investment, are really designed, they have core design features that are just patently inequitable. And I think that goes back to a lot of the problems that you already identified, Ms. Thompson, about past trade policy and the things that you'd like to rectify. So I'm very interested to hear about what the Biden-Harris administration can do to, I don't expect trade policy to do everything, but we have some very real problems on the ground that need to be addressed.
Thank you, Brian. Jamila, I'm wondering if you just have some thoughts. You know, clearly, when you change policy, we need to know that there will be resistance, and that resistance, you know, I'm thinking of your old boss. You know, resistance should be expected. So the question is, how do you meet that challenge? And Jamila, I heard you a concern from you about us getting weary, and frustrated, and that is probably what the communities that want to take us in a direction. That's probably exactly where they want us to go, is to get tired and weary. So I'm just wondering if, when you're hearing what Brian is talking about, and just the reality of who's resisting you in the United States, you know what I mean? What's your reaction to that? And maybe more importantly, where should we play a role? Because the priorities that you are outlining, worker-centered, a climate-centered, a human justice-centered policies, precisely reflecting our values. So I'm going to stop talking. Hopefully the question wasn't too big, but if you can have a reaction, and how do we meet this moment?
Sorry, it took me a second to unmute. First, you know, please call me Jamila. Brian, I was like, since we're going to be friends, since we're all friends, like I probably shouldn't be so formal. So,
well, you called me Father Gallagher.
I mean, that's the you know, that's the young person, young person at heart in me. So I apologize. So let me make it. And you're right. We've been in the room so many times together. The report that you did, I shared with my colleagues across USTR. And thought it was, first of all, timely. I appreciated the responses. I think in particular, our Africa office, our labor office, our environment and our natural resources office, and then our agriculture office, as some of the few who found it to be, I think, very interesting. So I'll take the question in a few parts. First, in terms of, and maybe to pick up on Kenya. So our negotiating team, they had the first round of negotiations with the Kenyans last week on the U.S.-Kenya Strategic Trade and Investment Partnership proposed engagement. And this is one where I think a lot of us are very excited about the potential. To be clear, it is not a free trade agreement. It builds on starting again on our shared principles, our shared values, our shared priorities, and it's an opportunity to chart with a trading partner, I think, this new path and this new approach in a thoughtful way, and a meaningful way, and an impactful way. The reason why I mention it, however, in particular, and I encourage you to visit our website where we provide, I think, readouts and updates of the conversations. The Kenyans were here a few months ago. Now it's crazy how time flies by. I don't know how many months, it could have been February. And for that round of discussions, because this that are outlined in terms of this new partnership are unique and different, we had an interagency briefing and exchange and brought our experts and our thought partners. So for example, this is the first trade agreement where we specifically have an area that scopes out the potential for advancing trade policy to the benefit of women, youth, vulnerable populations, and persons with disabilities. And it's a new path and a new way forward. So here we had our colleagues from the U.S. Department of Labor. So for example, the Office of Disability Employment Policy, ODEP, came over and presented. When we went to Kenya, they had a civil society, they had meetings with civil society and these organizations. And I think for the first time of really setting the table, I met with the team yesterday and they were excited about how encouraged the Kenyans were to have the opportunity to meet with civil society, how the fact that the ambassador met with labor representatives from across the continent on the margins of the African Leaders Summit in December. And so those workers, when they went back, because every single time we at the United States set the table, we set the table to include workers at some point, whether she's in the Philippines last week or whether they're here or there, we always try to include workers. And so those workers went back and they said, hey, we met with Ambassador Tai. and the Kenyans were like, oh, that's great. Let's also have these conversations. And the negotiating teams both left uplifted and excited about the importance of civil society and the importance of engagement. You know, I also say, and we can talk about this more, the experience of the election. The ambassador led the presidential delegation to the inauguration of President Ruto last September. And I think in particular to see two women as the Chief Justice, as the conveyors and holders of democracy in that moment was very moving. And that there's a commitment to, I think, preserve that energy and that of democracy at its best. Laura, to your where we get, I feel like it's very hard from an economic justice, from a social justice standpoint to get frustrated. It's very easy to get frustrated. Like I fight and petition for stuff at local government and it's like, it can burn you out. And you feel as if you're spread thin or that you're not being heard. The challenge where we are now is that we've laid out all of these plans and now we're at that point where we have to innovate. What we did for USMCA is not necessarily going to work for our other trading partners for a variety of reasons. One is USMCA was an FTA with tariff-related market access, so therefore you have the sticks and carrots approach that you can use, and we've used the rapid response mechanism within USMCA, I think successfully 8 times, most recently the announcement this week. But that's a different agreement and a different process. So what we did with USMCA is not necessarily going to be the same with Kenya, but we'd like to welcome new ideas, especially those that are meaningful as we start to brainstorm the realm of the possible, but also have I think, more honest conversations and discussions. And to know that, you know, I used to also say when I worked for Mr. Lewis and both Congresswoman Lee, I think the benefit of having a president who comes from so many years in Congress and a U.S. trade representative who comes from so many years in the House is that we have a passion for people. and we have a passion for a representational democracy, and we can take criticisms, but we can also, we just like to hear from you, and we'd like for you to keep us on course, and we hope that you will hold us accountable.
That is typically not a problem for our community. So that is a promise. Brian, when you, because we've talked a lot about civil society, and I know you've shared and others have shared that in many countries it's kind of a new concept, where in the U.S. you have a very developed set of advocates who are geared to offer solutions, maybe create a few problems. Who knows? This is beginning. Jamal, I'm so happy you talk about democracy when you talk about trade, because it is true that the lack of economic opportunity is very destabilizing, both here and I think throughout the world. Brian, tell us a little bit about the challenges of civil society. I know that you are very looped in, particularly in the climate space and in the food space. How can we use the moment to get the best input into the process and to really stand up opportunities in the United States and there to have meaningful input?
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura. I think I'm really glad that you're putting you're kind of touching this point of civil society and kind of where the resistances are there. And also thrilled to hear, Jamila, that this is important to you, that you and the administration want to listen to communities. So civil society in Kenya, as you mentioned, it's a new concept. So democracy in Kenya is really only 20 years old, depending on how you count, but really it's 20 years old. And even then, the situation of democracy is there are weaknesses in the system. And just to kind of speak about the role of civil society, often civil society also just means the political opposition. There is a growing sense, but it is still small or only part of the picture, that civil society is really a permanently situated kind of voice of communities, working really as an integral part of democracy. The current President Ruto, when he was before the International Criminal Court for the election-related violence, really was had very bad things to say about Kenyan civil society, accused them of essentially being traitors, and the government at the time really tried to clamp down on civil society. Fortunately, in Kenya, that was not as successful as similar efforts have been in some neighboring countries, but nonetheless, the freedom and the space that civil society actors have is quite limited. I mean, just one example is, in recent protests that were happening last month, both protesters and the police were assaulting journalists to prevent them from reporting on what was happening. And that's the situation here. So civil society, incredibly important. There are some very serious obstacles to really consulting with communities. And I think it's important to name that the Kenyan government may be an ally, but also is likely to not be an ally for in some of those cases.
Jamila, I'm just, what in terms of how much longer do we have with you? I know that you're going to have to leave us a little bit before our closing.
I think that I definitely have until 11:40. I'm trying to push it. Is that okay?
Yeah, no. Oh, we will take you as long as we get you. That is where we are at. In terms of resistance in the U.S., because I've got again, having a dirty little secret. I was in the corporate community. I have seen the light, and now I'm working happily at Network Lobby. But I do know the resources that downtown brings, and I guess my only fear is that people of goodwill can be outpersoned in terms of changing a system. And so in terms of resistance to your work, what are you seeing? I mean, I did see the Ways and Means Committee not long ago with Ambassador Tai, where they were so rude to her. And anybody who knows Catherine knows she's about as good an egg as you get. So, where are you seeing resistance? Again, where can we build to shore up what was really modeled under the Trump administration, frankly, with the USMCA, which maybe for very different reasons was a climate-centric, climate-centric, labor-centric agreement. And I'll just take your answer.
So maybe I'll start from USMCA and work my way backwards. So part of the reason why Ambassador Tai was appointed by the President Biden to this role is because of the fact when the previous administration was negotiating what became USMCA and rethinking NAFTA, it was House Democrats who stood up and said, for far too long, we have fought for labor and environmental issues to be central and a key component of trade policy. For far too long, we have said that it's important that you think about rules of origin, that we shift the burden from those whose rights have been violated and to make it so that it's not two states against each other fighting it out, but to those who are actually doing the violations. And so that was the work that she coordinated with House Democrats, with the Ways and Means Committee, with Speaker Pelosi, towards what became that monumental success that was USMCA. And that's the springboard that we're using for going forward. The USMCA is the floor, definitely not the ceiling, but to your point, that's the entire reason why she was selected for this position, and it goes back to that representational element of for far too long. Trade policy, those who have the resources are the ones, I think that we know on the Hill we say the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And in Congress, the beauty of the squeaky wheel is the fact that you have every 600,000 people have a representative. So that squeaky wheel is very diverse. That squeaky wheel includes progressives. That squeaky wheel includes those who think about environmental and social justice. That's not necessarily the same when it's the entire nation, and that squeaky wheel are definitely other interests. And so the way that we've approached is to expand the table, to say, okay, we're not taking away seats from those who have all of the resources, but it's very important that we set the table to include those other voices and that you ask us to come and to meet with you. A lot of the work that I do is framing for people who've never thought about trade policy, why trade policy matters to them. And sadly, it became a lot clearer in the aftermath of the pandemic and when supply chains became kitchen table discussions and conversations. And the way that we engage, I think, Brian, to your point is, and she said this, Ambassador said this with Secretary General Mene during the African Leaders Summit and in a few events publicly, is that the goal is to build, when we think about value chains, and there's a lot of talk about value chains, first, that the value is not extractive, it's not to the detriment of labor and the environment, it's not labor or environmental arbitrage, but also that the value is not all concentrated in certain areas, and so that it's complementary, especially with our trading partner, but that we have value at the lower, the middle, and the high end, so that we really are moving towards that, going back to that original intent of full employment, of good jobs, of combating the climate crisis, and then going future in terms of the good, clean, green jobs of the future. And so those are not in conflict. So I hope that answered a little bit of your question. To the latter point, I would just say to stay the course, to be informed, to share information, to share resources, to force us to speak to real people and to not speak to you know, those who have a gazillion PhDs and JDs and everything else. We try to make things plain and simple, but then to ask you to do the same, and then to give us some grace and space, so that we are able to. And to identify that every single engagement is not the same. What the ambition is when you have 14 partners at the table is very different from when you have one.
Yeah.
And so each one is not the same.
Right. I love the concept of grace and space. And I think that is even a challenge we have in our community, because trade policy, I always say, is difficult, almost under, it was an intent, and very much when USTR was created, and I think we shared this view, that it was going to be a mean, lean, very corporate structured sub-agency that reports to the president, that can move maybe faster than the Commerce Department. So, and all of the issues that you are talking about, it's hard to be a trade expert. Or let me just say, there's a mismatch between all of the content that is covered in these agreements and kind of connecting it with sisters that are doing human trafficking, or, you know, Brian, who is doing climate. Like, I always want to say these should be called climate and labor agreements, not trade agreements, because that is what we're talking. Tariffs are largely gone, and that is the conversation. Did you get a little bit more time, or are you going to need to leave?
No, I really want to hear Brian's speech. Brian,
Brian.
I'm just going to get in trouble. It's fine. I will say this, is that the big thing that came out, especially because of the Africa focus, is the AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, U.S. International Trade Commission. The results of the investigation were released last week, in terms of what the impact of AGOA has been. And so we at USCR are combing through the results of the investigation that the House Ways and Means Committee requested. And AGOA, as you know, expires in 2025 with most of our preference programs. I think CBTPA is an outlier, and GSP has already expired. We're marching towards what trade and development looks like in that 2025 mark.
Perfect. Yeah, I was thinking it was 25. Thank you for putting that out there. Brian, reaction, challenge, resistance. I've just loved your thoughts in terms of the conversation so far.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that is really striking me is that we are really putting our fingers on many of the same issues, and I'm really heartened to see what is on the radar of you, Jamila, but also by extension the administration. And I think for, you know, we're as members of civil society, as faith-based advocacy folks, I think there are ways that we can support that work, especially in your efforts to reach out to civil society. So I hope we can be supportive and do those things that you asked about, continuing to make the right wheels squeaky and to hold you accountable with a good balance on grace and space. But I, as encouraged as I am by the ambition behind these deals, you know, we will see what happens. Basically, the landscape in which these, especially in Africa, in which trade and investment is taking place, is so complex, and frankly, right now, just so incredibly balanced against the communities that we're trying to help, that I'm just really aware that this is an uphill battle. It's going to be a very long battle, and I will be really just grateful for any progress.
Did you want to comment again at that? There's a great question in the chat as well. Scott asks about imposition of tariffs. It's reminding me of the rapid response mechanism in the USMCA. And I know you said there are going to be limitations in these agreements, but can you talk to folks about that mechanism? Because I think that is the most innovative thing I've seen in the 30 years I've been following trade policy.
Yes, and then I will have to jump because so the way that when I talked to the ambassador about it, the way that I framed the rapid response mechanism is I personally I compare it to the Voting Rights Act and the pre-clearance process, and the fact that it shifts the burden. So in the past, and I think that many of us who fought for the inclusion of an enforceable labor chapter and um, and and U.S. free trade agreements were really dispirited in the aftermath of the loss of the Guatemala case. And we're so hopeful about the prospect of finally having a labor case and then that loss and figuring out how do we adjust in a way that is meaningful. And so the rapid response mechanism sets forth a partnership, a committee between the U.S. Department of Labor, International Labor Affairs Bureau, and USTR, where we have hotline and and can accept petitions and requests from workers who have faced and experienced challenges in executing their labor rights in Mexico and trade-related industry. Notably, the rapid response mechanism was developed at the same time that Mexico recognized that they also wanted to have good paying jobs. And they wanted to protect their workers, and they didn't want to be exploited by multinational corporations seeking a race to the bottom. So they had their own process of protecting the rapid response mechanism and all of the resources attached to USMCA really complemented the domestic activities that were happening in Mexico at the same time around worker protection and worker voice. And so when we renegotiated USMCA, it included, instead of pitting the United States government against the Mexican government, much more of a partnership, both in the labor space, but also in the environmental space, where, and just to note, on vaquita and tectooba, endangered fish species, where we can have conversations and recognize and highlight issues between the U.S. and the Mexican authorities, and within the government once we hear from civil society and stakeholders, and then it starts a pathway forward to really shift that pressure onto the companies, and in this case for labor, to allow workers to freely organize, to have freedom of association, to have the right to collective bargain, to have their voices heard, to form an association, and then to act. And so we've been successful in 8 of those cases so far. And that's the reason why it's unique compared to in the past of very lengthy, very costly, very timely cases where it was really pitting one government against the other and not the true actors. And in a process where by the time even, and we were not successful, but should we have been successful, and I just go back to the Voting Rights Act, you know, the actors, the action is already done, right? So you want to be able to get in there while the workers are still there, while there's an opportunity to correct action. And I think I saw from one of the organizations that have been tracking this really closely is that, you know, we also have been lifting up women worker voices in that basket too. The Voting Rights Act, when you cast that basket, we lifted up white worker voices and white voters in West Virginia, right? When you cast that basket that captures underserved communities, everybody's lifted up. It's not pitting against one or the other. So that's why I love the rapid response mechanism and the opportunity to build from it going forward.
I'm fearing that we're making you get in trouble with somebody who you're not supposed to get in trouble with. We will say goodbye. Do you mind, in terms of your email, if folks want to contact you, because there are a number of folks that are here that we would, and I don't know how we're going to move forward for panels that people missed. I think it is going to be taped so we can send some folks out, but we are very, very grateful for you. please tell your staff we will continue our efforts to be faithful to these issues, and just deeply grateful. Bye. Brian, maybe we can pick up the conversation in the last couple of minutes, because I do think the rapid response issue is a very important way forward. And there is curiosity in my mind whether we can actually push USTR to include these in these current negotiations. Again, just so folks know, unlike the old process where you pitted governments against each other, this is an opportunity for activists like us to take a petition against a company who is engaging in illegal logging and trying to import in the United States, is engaged in human trafficking, is in trying to import products into the United States, to hold the companies accountable rather than the governments. Because there are always geopolitical issues that limit a government's, ability to go after one government on one issue, like a labor issue or an environmental issue. What's your reaction to that kind of response system, particularly in the environmental space? Would that be effective? Would that help?
Yeah, so I think one key point is what Jamila raised about this not being a free trade agreement, the US-Kenya STIP right now, that in the context of a free trade agreement, you have carrots and sticks that you can use to make something like the rapid response mechanism work. So that, for example, if you have a factory in Mexico that is not in compliance with that process, they just do not benefit from the free trade agreement, so they have to pay the 20% tariff or whatever it would be. So it's a very, very effective kind of means of providing incentives. I wonder how those incentives would work in an agreement like the ones that are currently being negotiated by the Biden-Harris administration. But certainly, if it could work, I think that mechanism is really important. And there are a couple of aspects of it that I'm so encouraged by. So one is that communities, or potentially communities, could be the ones to make complaints. So if you had civil society groups on the ground in, say, Lamu, able to petition both trading partners to activate this process, simply to enforce existing environmental law, I think that could be incredibly effective. One reason why the judicial process in against the Lamu port has not been successful is simply because the defendant is pretty much the entire Kenyan government. So there's very strong incentive for the courts to not move, and they really would need to be pushed to move. Whereas if you have this kind of international trade dimension going on, Kenya very much values its environmental reputation in the global space. That could be a really effective means of simply saying, let's please do an environmental impact assessment. And maybe we don't accept goods that come through this port until we know that proper safeguards are in place. And the ones that have been missed have at least been remedied or compensated for in some way. So I think it's encouraging. I'd love to see how it works. Obviously not a panacea, but could provide communities with some avenue for really making a difference.
Yeah, I will say in conversations with very specific trade lawyers, of which I am not, there is some hope that we might be able to engage in a little creative lawyering to make that kind of process available in these pieces. I guess, Brian, maybe let's end with as we move forward, how because in our communities, I'm not sure that when you say trade, you think justice. So how do you think we move forward to make sure that in your work, people don't kind of dismiss it as a corporate something, but rather view it as a mechanism to get climate standards, climate enforcement, labor standards, labor enforcement, better food policy. What, give us some hope. How do we do this? And maybe it's just more a conversation like this, but what is your thinking?
Yeah, so I think I think one instinct is, okay, trade is corporate. I think a second instinct is like, this is technical. Like we've been talking about the rapid response mechanism as if that's like household dinner table conversation, which it's not. And I think anytime you kind of like bring some kind of technical piece of policy into conversation with folks who are really embedded actively with justice issues, there's often kind of a disconnect. But from my perspective, what I really enjoy is making those connections, because it's often those little triggers we can find that they don't fix everything, but they can accomplish something. And so if we can really tell stories and frame what we're trying to do in a way that kind of de-emphasizes the technical aspect of the discussion, and Jamila was talking about this, and say, here's what we can accomplish or what we could potentially accomplish, so that I can go to a community and say, hey, if we could get this thing done, there's a possibility we could hold this port hostage. And that, you know, kind of translational work is so important, and that's why we need good lawyers like you and like these specific trade lawyers who can really let us know what is in fact possible and put our heads together about where to go.
Perfect. We call this holy imagination, Pope Francis is sitting right with me, because in Fratelli Tutte, the call is to rebuild a new world. I guess that's always the call for justice, to do that and look at economic issues as central to human development as we know that they are. Brian, I'm going to leave that there. I just want to thank you for spending your evening with us. Send you blessings, and hope that conversation can continue. Thank you to everybody who's with us today. We appreciate your interest. We are more than happy to have conversation outside of EAD. This is work that's going on now. It is work for justice, and it's work we need to, as the faith community, be engaged in. So thank you so much.